Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this exciting program about General Logan. Just to tell a little bit about the society, it's the oldest of the state and territorial societies. We believe that Abraham Lincoln was one of the early members of the society. And we have a very robust program, and we definitely invite anyone with Illinois roots to join our society. I think you'll find it very worthwhile. Just a few bookkeeping items. The first is this webinar is being recorded. So if you have any difficulties, just turn off your camera, okay, with that. Also, at the bottom of your screen, we're going to use the Q&A function, not the chat function, but the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And we will try to answer any of the questions that you might have regarding the program today. So today's speaker is Gary I. Ecelbarger. His topic is General John A. Logan, A Life to Memorialize. Introducing Gary will be Illinois State Society board member Rod Ross. This past year, Rod rejoined the board of the society after a couple of years' absence. Back in the day, well, 20 years ago, Rod served as the historian for the Illinois State Society, having put on programs in the Capitol Building, Arlington Cemetery, Hillwood, Union Station, the National Cathedral, and the Lithuanian Embassy. This past year, Rod has been a mainstay for the Society's webinars. He facilitated a program on Julius Rosenwald and efforts to establish a national park complex focusing on the establishment of the Rosenwald schools in the American South. Then he turned his attention to addressing concerns of a commission established by Chicago's Mayor Lightfoot on statues deemed problematic, quote unquote. These included statues honoring Abraham Lincoln, John Logan, and Ulysses S. Grant. The initial webinar in the series was entitled, Why We Honor Lincoln. For his talk today, Gary Ecelbarger will take a different approach. Rather than attempting to address the concerns of the Chicago Monuments Commission, he'll let his presentation speak for itself. With that, here's Rod.
Thank you, Howard. I'm privileged today to introduce Gary L. Ecelbarger. I first met Gary a number of years ago when he was featured speaker for a Memorial Day program organized by the Logan Circle Civic Association here in Washington. Born in Western New York State and educated in Buffalo and then at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Gary's master's degree is in science rather than history. His day job with the Washington Hospital Center is as a nutritionist determining needed concentrations for those with feeding tubes or with IV solutions. It is as historian that Gary appears here today, a historian with countless historical books, articles rather, and 9 books to his credit. Gary's talk today utilizes material from his 2005 work, Black Jack Logan, An Extraordinary Life in Peace and War. Most but not all of Gary's books and battlefield tours concentrate on Civil War battles in the Shenandoah and the Battle of Atlanta. For well over 20 years, he and his wife and their 3 children have lived in Northern Virginia. Gary is a former president of the Bull Run Civil War Roundtable, and a charter member of the Kernstown Battlefield Association. If time permits during the Q&A session, I have a battery of backup questions relating not only to Blackjack Logan, but also to Gary's research interests, past, present, and future. And now, here's Gary.
Okay, thank you, Rod, for the introduction, and thank you, Howard. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out of your, I'm sure, busy days to listen to a very life of a very extraordinary person. I don't have an elaborate slideshow to present on this one. Again, I'm just going to have the information speak for itself, and it's some quite dazzling information. I'm going to start us out, take us back 135 years ago, almost 136. We're going to go back to Friday night, June 12th, 1885. And let's take us to Washington, D.C. Within DC today, you're going to have 36 roundabouts. We call them circles there. Most of them have statues in the middle. Back in the 1880s, they did not. The only one today that has is an all residential circle in the downtown area is called Logan Circle. We're going to go to that circle, but back then in 1885, it wasn't called Logan Circle. It was called Iowa Circle, and it was an all residential neighborhood back then as it was today. One of the residents in that circle was John A. Logan, who is by this time a very famous person, probably one of the most famous people in the country. He is a former 5-term congressman and is about to start his 3rd term in the US Senate, a failed presidential candidate and a Civil War hero, among other things, and the author of 3 books. He resides in a house that if you're facing the circle from the south to the north, he would be sitting at 10 o'clock. The house he rented still stands today. And he's in that house having just come and returned from a trip to New York City, where he visited his dying friend, Ulysses S. Grant, dying of throat cancer, the former president and war hero in New York. He will be serenaded this night. It's about 10 o'clock at night, and a huge crowd is gathering within this circle. Remember, no statue in the center. It's called Iowa Circle. And they're chanting his name and giving speeches, and there's a military company and there's a military band. And by the estimate of a Washington Post reporter who is recording this event on pen and paper, he estimates the crowd size at about 5,000. One unique thing, commonality in the entire crowd, except for the Post reporter, they are all African Americans. This is a serenade to General Logan from a crowd of African Americans who have considered him their hero for championing their rights. And they are rewarding him with that 3rd Senate win because they know that that will continue to serve them well, because he will continue to fight for their causes, and they're trying to bring him out. And after this, maybe about a 30 to 45-minute demonstration, the general, 58 years old, finally appears on the 2nd floor piazza and begins to address the crowd. And if it's typical of any of Logan's speeches, there was somebody that talked about Logan's speeches, not this particular night, but described the speeches like this. He said, all of his words are ideas, and they come forth flash, 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 until you are dazzled at the quick succession and almost puzzled at your comprehension. In common phrase, he thinks lightning, a steam gun discharging its 100 shots in sudden and continuous succession, is not more sudden, sustained, or certain. Keep up those discharges for 3/4 of an hour unintermittingly, and you have some faint type of the physical effect of just one of Logan's speeches. Now, that description is very apt, but usually he shortchanges Logan, because at the time, those kind of speeches did not go on for 3/4 of an hour. They usually went on for 2 to 3, sometimes even longer than 3 hours. But on the night of June 12th, that description was very apt, because Logan perhaps didn't speak much more than a half hour, 45 minutes, primarily due to the lateness of the night. He went out and he thanked the crowd for coming to serenade him. He told them that he would continue to fight for their causes because there's still so much to fight for. He talked about his visit to U.S. Grant up in New York, and talked about how together they will continue to champion for the rights of African Americans. And at the close of this fairly short address, he said, again, thanking you for this demonstration and this evidence of esteem. I now invite as many of you as will to pass through this house in which I reside for the present, so that I may be gratified in shaking your hand. And over 1,000 people took him up on that offer. They lined up in front of that house beginning at around midnight, and single file, they went through the front parlor, shook right hands with Logan, passed through the back parlors and out the back door. And it was a very poignant event. One of the most incredible things about it is they knew who Logan was, and they knew what his past was. This was a man who had a Saul to Paul conversion regarding the rights of African Americans. He was a former persecutor of African Americans and their rights in the 1850s, and he had completely transformed and turned into their champion. And they have forgiven him for it and have completed this serenade. And he completed that conversion with that demonstration that you've just noticed at the end, with him shaking hands with them. What I'd like to do now is go back to his earlier life, and I want to talk about this life that we need to memorialize and discuss more in terms of his social philosophy, but I'm going to do a little bit of a cradle to grave version of it in a very short period of time. So let's go back to the 1820s now. Logan was born in February of 1826 in Southern Illinois. Illinois, a free state, part of the old Northwest Territory, which was converted into a series of free states, is a very long state from north to south, almost 400 miles. The northern part of Illinois is on the same horizontal as the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border. And the southern end of Illinois is on line with the North Carolina-Virginia border. That gives you an idea about how its domestic and political philosophy might vary from one end to the other as well. This part of Illinois, the southern part, was probably the first part that has actually had the highest concentration in its early settlement. And as you can imagine, most of the settlers of Southern Illinois were former Southerners. In fact, Logan's mother hailed from North Carolina, probably descendant of a slaveholding family. His father, even though he was raised in Ohio, practiced medicine in Mississippi and Missouri, and had purchased and owned slaves before transferring into Illinois himself. So Logan is the son of a former slaveholder. And he grew up in Southern Illinois. And by our standards, he had a very, very primitive education, but it was probably above the norm for his peers in that area at the time in Jackson County, Illinois. And one of his early jobs was he was a jockey for his father. He raced horses. He was a very wiry looking teenager, very dark complected. That's why he eventually earned the name of Blackjack. And he had that long hair as well. But he could race horses at breakneck speed. Well, as a young adult, he first got some notoriety because he was always known as a good talker and a natural leader. And when the Mexican War broke out, he entered the war with a lieutenancy representing his area. And even though he didn't get to see any action, he and the company he was involved with never got past Santa Fe, New Mexico. The experience taught him a little bit about how to lead a company of men, even though they were never involved in a battle. When he came back, he practiced the study of law, and he did that from his uncle, from which his middle name is derived. And he became a lawyer. In fact, he ran for prosecuting attorney in the early 1850s and won that. It was an elected seat. And he was a prosecuting attorney in the third judicial circuit. If you remember from Abraham Lincoln, he practiced on the 8th Judicial Circuit. Well, Logan was a prosecutor in the 3rd judicial circuit. And he eventually opened up his own law practices where he mainly was defending clients, but in this case, he was prosecuting them. And this leads me to one quick story I got to tell about this. You can't do this anymore, apparently, but back then you could. At the very end of his term, he had a case of a horse thief with very flimsy evidence, and it was in one of these southern counties that he represented in his prosecuting term. And despite the flimsy evidence, as people would always say, Logan was great at convincing everybody and a very good talker. He was able to convict a man with a jury of his peers and find him guilty. Well, the judge knew better. And through whatever channels he could use, the judge decided that this trial needed to reconvene in a different county. And he threw out the case and remember, Logan's term had just ended. Well, the man who was just convicted was wise enough to hire Logan as his defense attorney. The trial convened in a different county a few months later. Logan defended the man, and guess what? He got him an acquittal. So when a reporter came up to Logan and said which verdict was correct, Logan smugly looked at him, smiled, and said, well, both of them, of course. So convicted and acquitted the man on the same charge in a few months apart. Now that has to be a record. But it just shows how convincing you could be, the gift of his gab, the gift of his persuasion, and the gift of his leadership. That natural gift would have him enter politics, and it ran in the family. His uncle was a U.S. congressman. His father was an Illinois state legislator, a Democrat. And in fact, if you are familiar with Illinois and you think of Springfield, Illinois, it's in Sangamon County, the county just north of it, with the only the first city named after Lincoln. It's in Logan County. That Logan County was named after Logan's father, Dr. John Logan, the former slave owner who moved into Illinois. So Lincoln and the older Logan, even though they were across the aisle from each other, they were friends. So the younger Logan followed in his father's footsteps, and he wins his first of 2 seats in the Illinois state legislature in 1853. And back then, the revised state constitution had passed 5 years earlier in 1848. And there was a provision in that constitution that had a very draconian measure against freed African Americans, prohibited them from settling into Illinois. The legislatures between 1848 and 1853 decided not to take up that provision, but the young Logan was trying to make his mark with his very southern oriented district that he's representing. And that district, by the way, is what became the lower 18 counties of Illinois. It was called Egypt, Illinois at the time. And one of the reasons or associations with that is the most southern point, Cairo, looks like it's Cairo, but Illinoisans know it's pronounced as Cairo, Illinois, and that's Logan's territory. He will see that provision carried through. He will bring it to the floor. He will debate for its passage against some opposition, but it eventually passes, and it will be coined as Logan's Black Code or Logan's Black Law, and it imposed heavy fines on any freed African American that tried to settle in the state. People that freed Blacks that were already living there were exempt, but it imposed heavy fines on those that tried to settle after its passage. So Logan will become infamous and famous for it at the same time, depending on what part of Illinois or the country you were looking at. And remember, think of how I opened this talk. He becomes a champion of African Americans. So this should be kind of astounding. We're already talking about a period about 32 years apart. So that's how he initially makes his mark in Illinois politics. He eventually will carry his political powers into the U.S. House of Representatives. He will be elected 2 terms as a Democrat, Southern-oriented Democrat. They called it a Jacksonian Democrat after Andrew Jackson at the time. And Logan will win his first one in 1858, and he'll win his re-election in 1860. And if you remember, in 1860, there's a presidential election underway with two of the four candidates running are from Illinois. Stephen A. Douglas, the Southern oriented Democrat, of who Logan is aligned, and Abraham Lincoln is the Whig, converted to a Republican. Republican Party started in Illinois roughly about 1856. So Lincoln is the first Republican, second Republican candidate for president in 1860, the first very popular and prominent Republican in Illinois. And Logan campaigns hard for his reelection in Southern Illinois in Egypt, and of course for Douglas and against Abraham Lincoln. And when the dust settled at the end of that election, Logan wins easily. Lincoln wins the state of Illinois, and we know he wins the presidency. But he does that with only 39% of the popular vote because there are 4 people running. He wins Illinois, but by almost an embarrassing low margin. And the reason for that was primarily because of Logan's campaigning against him in Egypt. Of the 28,000 votes cast in 1860 in Southern Illinois, Lincoln only got 5,200, 17%. That was it. All right. So Lincoln won't forgive Logan for that. And he'll really drag his feet, so to speak, when it comes to efforts to get Logan a command in the Civil War, because we know that right after Lincoln's election, secession and Civil War initiates all within that next year. So by 1861, and Logan, even though he seemingly seemed aligned with Southern proclivities, was definitely a very pro-union person. The problem with Logan was whenever he denounced secession, which he did very vehemently, he couldn't help himself, but he almost in the same breath always denounced abolitionists. And this is what really rankled newspaper editors like those of the Chicago Tribune, who had nicknamed Logan Dirty Work Logan. And sometimes in their print, they would shorten it to DW for Dirty Work Logan, because Logan's on the House floor, on the House of Representatives floor, once said that he is in support of the fugitive slave law. It was constitutionally protected, of course. And he said he would, if anybody called this dirty work, he was willing to do this dirty work. So he was called Dirty Work Logan. Well, he is denied any chance to raise a regiment, which he really wanted to do, because he was convinced by the Lincoln administration that there's no need to do that. This is going to be a short war. So he and a little knot of congressmen go out to witness what's supposed to be the first great land battle of the war, as they work their way out to Manassas, Virginia. And in a prelude to that fight, at an action near a place called Blackburn's Ford, Logan becomes a literal fighting politician when he sees a shirking soldier from New York State running from the Bull Run River, and Logan says, give me your gun." The gun's handed to him, and in his congressional clothes, he goes down to that stream, crouches in position, and fires a few shots at the Confederates on the other side. He comes back to Washington and really pushes to be given a regiment. They realize after the Battle of Bull Run, which occurs 3 days later, that it is not going to be a short war. And Lincoln finally awards Logan a colonel's commission, and Logan is allowed to raise a regiment. The regiment he raises is mostly within his congressional district, the 9th Congressional District of Illinois, those lower 18 counties that were primarily anti-Lincoln counties. And it became known as the 31st Illinois Volunteers, and nicknamed the Dirty First Illinois because of Dirty Work Logan. Well, Logan became a natural warrior. Through the course of the Civil War, he became a star. He rose through the ranks from colonel to brigadier general to major general, commanding a regiment to a brigade to a division to a corps. By the time the Union Army is conducting its victory parade in May of 1865, Logan is leading the Army of the Tennessee, the most successful army on the face of the earth at that time, not the biggest, but the most successful, down Pennsylvania Avenue. And of the major armies that are officially disbanded after the Civil War, Logan is only one of 4 corps commanders who was not West Point trained. This was a natural warrior, a natural star. So much so that when Civil War commissioned generals go back to the regular army, as we call it, after the war, they return with lower ranks. Let me give you a perfect example of a name I'm sure you're familiar with. George Armstrong Custer, who was a general in the Civil War, goes back into the regular army as a captain. General Logan, and by the way, Custer was a West Point grad. General Logan, who had no West Point education, no military experience except for sitting in Santa Fe for a few months during the Mexican War, because of what his prowess within the Civil War, is offered a brigadier generalship in the regular army after the war. I just wanted to bring that out. I'm not going to talk about the Civil War today, but I wanted to show you how much of a prominent general he really was. We always say he's the best political general in the Civil War. Well, that's a disservice because most of the political generals had quite a bit lacking. Logan was one of the best generals, period, fighting in the for the North or the South, fighting in the Eastern or Western theater. He was just one of the best generals, period. And he particularly shined in the Vicksburg campaign in 1863 and in the Atlanta campaign of 1864. All that said, he ended up being Grant's political general more than Lincoln's, because while Lincoln kept dragging his feet at giving Logan promotions, it was Grant that always intervened and saw that Lincoln was just still a little biased against Logan for representing Egypt, those lower 18 counties, and always pushed through for Logan's promotions. So Logan and Grant were very tight from the very beginning. I bring all this up because what I want to talk about during the Civil War is that not only did the war make him a star, it completely changed his social and his political philosophy. The man that enters the war deriding and railing against abolitionists in the same breath as secessionists, and he definitely hated secessionists. The same dirty work Logan that always talked about willing to do the dirty work, the same son of a former slave owner, the same man linked with the Black Codes, entered the war that way, but certainly didn't leave it that way. And when I investigated that, I can't to this day pinpoint exactly when that happened. And yes, I lay awake until 2 or 3 a.m. oftentimes at night thinking about that. At least I used to. But I can't pinpoint exactly when that happened, but it looks like it happened in stages. We know in 1862 as a brigadier general, he's stationed in Jackson, Tennessee, and I think all the evils of slavery are really borne out at that place. There's an incident with a runaway slave woman named Zela, Z-E-L-A, who escapes a very abusive slave master and gets within Union lines in Logan's territory and ends up in Logan's camp. And they protect her from the owner who's trying to intervene and get her back. And they keep her protected. But this very nefarious slave owner sends a message to her that he's dying. This is a month later. And she buys into this and slips through the Union lines to go visit him for a last time, which was his last request before he died. Well, he had faked the whole thing, recaptured her and sold her to another slave owner in Georgia, and she'll spend the rest of her life probably in slavery, at least the next 4 years until the Civil War ends. So I think Logan was certainly changed by that. He probably was also affected when there was an accidental shooting of one of his men of a young Black boy. And through an interchange of letters that I read, I could see that Logan was personally embarrassed when he was asked the name of that boy, and he has to admit that he doesn't know the name. And one must wonder if he thought, would he have the same problem if that kid that was shot, if he was white? So all these things I think are starting to play with him, and you start to see it in his speeches. What speeches is Logan giving? He must be giving some addresses to his men, because newspapers that used to support Logan, remember I talked about the ones that didn't like him, dirty work, the ones that supported him were in the North were the Southern Aligned newspapers in Southern Illinois, in Southern Ohio, and Southern Indiana. And they start passing around little articles that Logan is giving pro-abolition speeches. And Logan would would write a rejoinder that would get published in the paper saying, I don't give any political speeches. Now note, he didn't rail against abolitionists. He just said, I don't give political speeches. So he wasn't, you could see that stepwise change. He goes to, he gets a little leave of absence. He gives a speech in Carbondale, near his, which was his hometown in Southern Illinois in 1862. It gets a lot of play, gets a lot of press at that time in 1862. By 1863, after he has very heroically, as a division commander, finished the Vicksburg campaign, Logan is given the post of honor by U.S. Grant, and he is allowed to lead his troops into the city that has just been captured, Vicksburg, on the 4th of July, 1863. By the way, Vicksburg won't celebrate the 4th of July for the next 80 years after that. They were still kind of peeved about that one. So Logan leads his troops in there. And then when they are paroling, setting free the Confederate officers to return home, to basically lay down their arms and return home, they're supposed to be done for the war. They're trying to get all enslaved people that had been around the streets of Vicksburg at the time, trying to scoop them all up and take them south with them. The one that railed against this, we know this in writings and indeed and by people's testimony, is none other than Blackjack Logan. And by the way, he's called Blackjack because of his swarthy complexion. So with that, Logan certainly is starting to demonstrate his antipathy against slave owners, and he's trying to work to keep slaves that have been recaptured by Union and freed because of that. He doesn't want to see them end up back in slavery again. General Grant will send Logan back to Illinois for 30 days. This is in the summer of 63 to, quote, recover your health. Logan wasn't sick. Grant knew he wasn't sick. Again, Logan is Grant's political general. Grant sends him to Illinois to give a series of pro-union speeches to disaffected areas of Southern Illinois, because the war is growing old. There's hundreds of thousands of people dying. And you have pockets within Illinois that are certainly showing the strains of this, and the anti-war fervor is really, really ramping up. And Logan, as this new war hero, is sent to Southern Illinois to give these speeches. And he goes back to Carbondale, his hometown where he just spoke the previous summer. And he's back there again with a crowd of 5,000. And he says, he knows he already has this reputation of being called an abolitionist on him. And this is a crowd of his former congressional district. And he said, well, if being against rebels and traitors is an abolitionist, I guess I need to be counted within that. In other words, he wasn't railing against abolitionists. He wasn't calling himself an abolitionist because he was for overthrowing the Constitution, which you would be if you were an abolitionist. But he said that abolitionists had the same ideals as he did about prosecuting the war against the Confederacy and seeing it as a pro-union win. So that was quite astounding. Remember, this was the old dirty work Logan. So he's giving these speeches in a couple in Southern Illinois, and then he goes up to Chicago and gives, quite frankly, about the same speech. But to show you the power of his oratory, Chicago's about, I believe, the 7th or the 8th largest city in the country at that time. And Logan is given a speech to the equivalent of 1 out of 10 people that live in that city. 12,000 people gather in the courthouse square in a time when there's no amplification of your voice with microphones, and Logan can address that kind of a crowd. And he's certainly making Grant's leave of absence to recover your health well worthwhile to rouse up Union feeling. Those speeches are reproduced in pamphlet form. Logan is becoming more famous on the home front as well as what he's accomplishing in the war. But what you're seeing is that stepwise movement from railing against abolitionists to not railing against them to now siding with them. By the spring of 1864, almost early summer, it's early June, Logan is embarking upon the Atlanta campaign, and he's a corps commander in that campaign. In fact, that painting behind me is Logan at Kennesaw Mountain, just so you know. which is part of that campaign. So it's about 3 weeks before that battle. Logan gets a message, and this one's quite astounding. It's a newspaper clipping. There's all these little political parties forming because the election of 1864 is coming up. And there's these tickets. When I say ticket, a political ticket is your presidential candidate and his vice presidential running mate for different tickets. Well, Logan found out that he was being talked up as a vice presidential candidate on the abolition ticket. On the abolition ticket in 1864, in June of 1864. Of course, he kind of brushed that off and said, well, that's quite the joke. And I don't think he was sided with abolition yet, but you could see how everybody else was considering him at the time because of the kind of speeches he was making. In fact, he was very pro-Lincoln at that time. After the Atlanta campaign ended with the surrender of Atlanta on September 2nd, Lincoln will send prominent political generals, including John Logan, back to Illinois after he saw what Logan did for Grant in 1863. You send him back there in 1864. Lincoln's a Republican on the Union Party ticket, and Logan is sent back to Illinois to campaign primarily for the Republican Party. Logan's a Democrat, technically. He's no longer the congressman because when he was commissioned brigadier general, he had to give up his congressional seat. So he's campaigning for the Republican running for that congressional seat. Remember, in the district that voted against Lincoln 23,000 to 5,000 just 4 years earlier. So this is Logan going back now, planning 16 speeches throughout Southern Illinois, which is now 16 counties of Egypt instead of the previous 18. So there's only 22 or 23,000 voters instead of 28 the first time. And it's a very perilous situation for Logan. The Southern Illinois hates him. He has to bring a gun to his speeches, lay it on a dais to show that he is not going to tolerate anybody that tries to rush him or shout him down. And boy, they tend to shout him down, including his sister, who supports Southern causes. His own mother won't speak to him for several years after the war is over. So this Logan's position, pro-union generally, but now supporting the abolition of slavery, is rankling all of his former friends in Southern Illinois, and it's tearing apart his family as well. But he gives a series of speeches for all the Republicans. This Democrat has given a speeches for all the Republicans in Southern Illinois. And the same district that voted so heavily against Lincoln voted for Lincoln in 1864 by 1,000 votes. Logan turned that district around. All the Republicans that Logan campaigned for won by fairly narrow margins, as you can imagine. But it was Logan that was responsible for that. There has been no accomplishment by a true political general in a 6-month period, both at war and on the home front, than what you saw that Logan did from May of 1864 in Georgia through September, and then from September and October campaigning for Lincoln in Southern Illinois in 1864. So dramatic change. And that's why Logan becomes this hero on both ends. So when he gives up that brigadier generalship after the war ends, he is already promoting the 13th Amendment, which gets ratified in December of 65. Remember, Logan doesn't have a political position yet. He's just a general after the war, but that puts an end to slavery, makes slavery illegal throughout the land. Now Logan starts promoting what eventually will become the 14th, which is citizenship for African Americans and all others born in the U.S., and for the 15th Amendment. That was his baby. That's the one Logan really pushed for, which was back then called Negro suffrage, but was for the rights of African Americans to vote. So he's pushing for this in the 1860s, and he runs for Congress again in Illinois on an at-large seat for that position. All the former papers that hated Logan in the 1850s because he was D.W. Logan love him now because he is fighting for the causes of African Americans. All the papers that supported him in the southern parts of these states of the old Northwest hated him at this stage. A perfect example is a Southern Illinois paper writing, we are tired of the vulgar and vile Logan. Maggots would sicken on him. Didn't matter. Logan wins that seat as a Republican. He has switched parties. His social and political philosophy has completely changed. And now he is supporting causes and rights of African Americans at a time when it was not politically expedient to do so. Perfect example. Logan enters Ohio in the fall of 1867, campaigning in the special election that's going to be held there in October for a series of Republican candidates, but also to have an amendment to their constitution for the Negro suffrage, for the rights of African Americans to vote in that state. It's not the law of the land yet. It's not an amendment to the US Constitution, but there's about a handful of states that have already allowed it, and they're trying to push for it in Ohio. It is so unpopular that it gets cremated in that fall election by over 40,000 votes, which for Ohio back then is a huge, huge margin. But Logan's speeches had quite the effect of showing what his true colors were, no pun intended. One of the former supporting papers that has turned on Logan, called the Defiance Democrat, has said something to the effect, they called Logan's speech his abolition harangue. Quite a change, right? His abolition harangue. And he said, General Logan is a humbug, his Negroes ditto. So they are linking Logan with African Americans, and those that are completely against voting rights for African Americans are showing their true colors as well. So Logan is now becoming their worst enemy. Well, as we know, Logan wins these seats. He's become very powerful head of the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm going to end by showing how that'll have an effect on him for what we're going to celebrate at the end of May. But I should let you know that, of course, the 15th Amendment does get ratified in 1870, I believe. So Logan's efforts have worked well, and he is well regarded in the African American community, obviously by this time for that. By 1880, for the Frederick Douglass, the world famous Frederick Douglass, is campaigning with Logan on sharing the stump when they're giving political speeches together. And in 1884, Douglass is supporting Logan for the presidency of the United States. He says the Republican Party is generally supportive of African American rights, but he said in a party of candidates for the Republican ticket, most of them are invertebrate animals, but General Logan has the spine like the Brooklyn Bridge. So Frederick Douglass is a huge fan of General Logan at this stage. And the New York Times will have several articles in 1884 about with the titles "Negro Support General Logan." Then they have General Logan and the Negro Vote: the early war hero and the early hero of the anti-slavery movement. So even though it's not really true that Logan was the early mover of the anti-slavery movement, he's already being linked with that. So you can see where this complete conversion has taken place, leading to that June 12th event that I just talked about. When Logan was still before he even became a senator, finishing one of his terms in Congress in 1868, he used his war hero status, his congressional power, and his work as the second president of the Grand Army of the Republic. He turned that fraternity organization of Civil War vets into a very powerful political lobby association, which he would fight for pensions for Civil War soldiers. But he used it for a special purpose in 1868. He saw over the years, and actually took part in one in Southern Illinois, a series of regional grave decorating ceremonies. And he decided to nationalize that with the GAR document, Special Orders or General Orders number 11, which set aside then May 30th as a day to commemorate soldiers' graves, primarily Union soldiers, by strewing them with flowers because they bloom at that time of the year, and to celebrate that every May 30th. That very first decoration day, Logan was in Arlington Cemetery, celebrating it with Ulysses S. Grant and other Civil War heroes. The very next year, Logan is celebrating again in different areas of the country from that point on. But beginning in the second year, in 1869, he calls it what it is today, Memorial Day. And the only thing that's changed is it changed from May 30th to the last Monday in May. Logan will call that in his later years the proudest act of his life, the celebration of the nationalization and of Memorial Day. But the last days of his life turned out to be dramatically short. Logan's war service eventually will kill him. He developed rheumatism from cold days around Fort Donelson in February. And when he dies from one of these attacks, internal attacks, shortly after Christmas in 1886, and he's dead the day after, just at the age of 60 years of age. Logan becomes the seventh person, only the seventh person in our history to lie in state in the U.S. Capitol. And he's buried in the old near the old soldiers' home in their cemetery today in a mausoleum not too far off from Rock Creek Park. And he was honored throughout the country, but primarily, if you read most Black newspapers, they were highly commemorating him and how his loss, they believe, has affected their causes for the future as well. And that's how Logan was looked at, and that's how we should view that complete Saul to Paul conversion. So indeed, it has been a life to memorialize. And today we can think about Logan. He's commemorated in various areas. Iowa Circle is now Logan Circle, with a statue that was erected there in the 1920s. There's that famous statue in Grant Park that was put up in the 1890s. In Southern Illinois, I'm wearing a shirt for John Logan College, a community college in Carterville in Southern Illinois, not too far from the home he grew up in, which is now an archaeology excavated. The cabin essentially is near General John A. Logan Museum, and it is just off Route 13, which since 2005, and there's the sign for it behind my left shoulder, John A. Logan Memorial Highway is Route 13 between Murfreesboro, his hometown, and the state of Kentucky. You know, in an era today in which there's discussions and events, and successful ones at that, to actually remove statues because the people depicted in the statues aren't living back then by today's moral standards. General Logan is a guy who we need more statues for, without a doubt. As I've just depicted, this is a man, we need more statues to memorialize him for his accomplishments as one of the greatest political generals in world history, as a fighter for the preservation of the Union, for the early champion of the rights of African Americans, and of course for Memorial Day. But we need more statues for him because it's commemorating this country. It's what we stand for. This is a country not only that celebrates the best and the brightest where they succeed, but people like Logan, the opportunists, the overachieving B students of life. Only in this country, the equal to succeed as the best and the brightest or the best educated. That's what we celebrate with Logan. And the other thing we celebrate with Logan is that we're a country of second chances, where we give people the opportunity to overcome past discussions and make good amends of that. And no better example for that is General Logan himself. I'd like to end today by one way that we know about General Logan and we commemorate him, and it's got a whole Illinois take to it. It's in the state song. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it. Right? But the song is adapted from a poem from the 1890s, and I think it became the state song of Illinois in 1925 or early 1920s. And so it's about 100 years old. And there's only 3 surnames mentioned in that song, in the stanzas of the song. And of the 3 surnames, only Logan is native to the state of Illinois, the only one who was actually born there. And his is only one of the 2 names that's repeated in the final stanzas. And this is how the final stanza goes. On the record of thy years, Abraham Lincoln's name appears. Grant and Logan and our tears, Illinois, Illinois. Grant and Logan and our tears, Illinois. I thank you.
That was wonderful, Gary. Before we move to your career away from Logan, talk a little bit about the Logan statue and the two bas-reliefs there in Logan Circle here in Washington, DC?
Well, you're probably gonna have to speak on the bas reliefs. The statue was put up in the early 1920s. Remember that used to be Iowa Circle. And let's see, one of the bas reliefs is
Well, it's almost a takeoff on your book title, you know, Logan, An Extraordinary Career in Peace
yeah,
and
but
War.
one of them is supposed what wasn't one of them
Logan and
the
his corps commanders.
yeah, but the other one is the political, was that the impeachment one for Andrew Johnson? Was it in that one?
No, I think it has to do with Logan and the luminaries. So even though he's being sworn in and he was already a senator by then, apparently Mary Logan said, hey, art should be inspirational and not a static representation.
Yeah. Well,
So-
like I said, I don't know. I don't remember the bas reliefs. So
Let's move on to your career as a writer. How did you get interested in Logan in the first place?
well, I was most of my early books on the Civil War were battles and campaigns, and I remember just getting one of those gray covered Time Life books in the 80s. And it was about the Atlanta campaign, of which I ended up spending the last 12 years working on. And I was really taken because the center images in there were from the Atlanta cyclorama, which has been moved and currently is in a place where it really needs to be, which is the Atlanta Historical Center, and renovated as well. Beautiful painting, I believe the second largest oil painting in the world. And there were a lot of cuts of that painting in this in that version of the Time Life books, and of course it features Logan. In fact, that battle used to be called General Logan's Battle because of his heroic efforts in that battle. So when I decided to do a little background work on him, I had just finished a different biography of a very obscure Union general. I found that Logan's life was really, really fascinating. And the other benefit on my behalf is living fairly close to Washington, D.C., is that Logan had sets of papers in various areas of the country, but his largest collection by far was at the Library of Congress. So it allowed me several times to go visit the manuscript division and do a lot of work going through and researching his papers. And I must say it was of all my books, it was by far my favorite one to write. And I don't think I could do another cradle to grave biography ever again because of that book. He can't be topped, in my opinion.
So all of your books are military related, except the one on Lincoln and the one you're working on for Washington. Could you describe?
Well, that one,
these
the
two?
Washington one's military as well. The
And-
Lincoln one wasn't. The Lincoln one was about his nomination for the presidency. So it was Lincoln before the beard, as I call it. The Washington one that I'm working on now is George Washington during looking at him in 1 year during the Revolution, between the 4th of July, 1777 and the 4th of July, 1778. So that's more of a military book as well.
So speaking of Logan and the military, Logan succeeded General McPherson after McPherson's unfortunate demise. Why was it that Logan did not get permanent command of McPherson's army?
Okay, well, he was the battle that I just talked about, the cyclorama, that was July 22nd, 1864. And McPherson was killed during that battle. He is the only major, on the Union side, the only major general in charge of a major army to be killed in the Civil War. And this happened in the last 10 months of the war. And immediately Logan succeeded him because he was the ranking subordinate officer on the battlefield. He was a corps commander, and he ranked the other two corps commanders that were there. And he was responsible for turning this chaotic moment of losing your army commander and helped by his presence helped win that battle. But Logan was not West Point trained, and the overall commander of all the armies in that whole theater was William Tecumseh Sherman. And he had a proclivity to hire in top department commands only West Point educated and trained personnel, because he looked at these departments not just as field armies, which Logan really excelled at, and even Sherman acknowledged it. He said Logan was perfect in combat. But he looked at it as a department as much as an army, meaning there's a lot of papers to push, so to speak, and to take care of a lot of logistical and strategic things. And he felt that a West Pointer would have been more beneficial for that. And for that reason, he chose Oliver Otis Howard, for which Howard University is named, and the man who started the Freedmen's Bureau. So he gave, just a few days after the Battle of Atlanta, Howard was put in charge of the Army. For Logan's part, he sulked about it for a day, but he went back down to Corps Command and served in that role. And it was all for the wrong reasons that Sherman did this. But in the long run, Logan's probably was better suited as an inspirational commander at the Corps level, rather than leading a full army where he wouldn't be, his full commanding presence wouldn't be in front of the troops like he could be in a little bit smaller role. But as it turned out, just about 8 months later, before the very end of the war, Howard left the Army to take charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, and Logan got the command of the Army of the Tennessee back, and that's why he was able to lead it down Pennsylvania Avenue as the head of the Army, and was able to discharge it as one of the only as the only commander of a Union Army that was not West Point trained in charge of an army.
So Gary, tell me how it is that you, a scientist, have made such a contribution in the field of history.
Well, I always, I always liked history as a kid. My father was a big Washington fan, for example. And I took it as all my electives in college. So I always liked history. The only crossover I could say with, with my science degree is I learned, at least in graduate school, how to really dissect research articles. And I kind of had a knack for that with historical works as well, where I could take primary sources that are from the original author and look at it and study it and come up with a different conclusion than other people that had written about it. So that's just tends to be the crossover, but it's more has to do with my, I'm just as interested in history as I am in science. I just chose one as my profession and the other as my primary academic profession, and the other one was a secondary one.
So for the record, you have 9 books to your credit. We've mentioned the biography of Logan. And we've talked about the Lincoln's election book. What are the other books you've written?
Well, since we brought that, we'll do the 3. I do my personality works apparently on generals or on people who are named with an L. So it's Lincoln and Logan. And then the third one was a general named Frederick Lander, for whom Lander, Wyoming is named for. For whom he's named for. I just used 4 twice. Look what I did there. So that's the 3 L persons. And the other ones are about battles. So my first book was about a Shenandoah Valley campaign battle called We Are In For It, the Battle of Kernstown. I did another book about a battle in that campaign called 3 Days in the Shenandoah, which is about the Battle of Winchester and the Battle of Front Royal. And my last 2 battle books were on the Battle of Atlanta, the July 22nd contest that we just talked about, and then a battle 6 days later called the Battle of Ezra Church. And I had partially written another book that Logan was involved with in the Atlanta campaign that I'll eventually get to. And it's a book about the Battle of Dallas, which is a town in Georgia, not the Texas city, but a town in Georgia. The other books that I had written or more co-written were, I was hired by Time Life to write a Shenandoah Valley book and to research articles for that. So that one's primarily my work. And then I did a lot of work on the next volume that they're working on, which was on the Battle of Fredericksburg. So I think that adds up to my 9 books.
So before I let you go, talk a little bit about how you got into the gig of giving battlefield tours.
Okay, that was actually when I first moved to Northern Virginia from Wisconsin after I got my master's degree. I joined a roundtable in a Civil War roundtable called the Bull Run Civil War Roundtable. I eventually was 1 year for the president of that organization. But we started up something called the We Are Cheap and Proud Tours, where we got a lot of members of the organization. We would get together on various weekends, and in a caravan of cars, we would go to different area battlefields, because that huge advantage we had was most of the big battles of Virginia and Maryland and even Gettysburg weren't that far away from where we're all located, all within like an hour, hour and a half drive. And we would designate different stops on the battlefield where each of us would prepare presentations to give. And that's how I got my start, kind of cutting my teeth, so to speak, by giving those kind of tours over a couple years. And then I lucked into a national tour done by a Civil War society that was in charge of a magazine. And then I got hired by a couple different history groups and local groups, and kind of took off from there. And I've been doing tours now for, wow, but over a quarter of a century now. Yep, this is my 26th year doing tours.
So where does the Marine Corps staff rides fit into?
Oh, that was late 90s. Yeah. I happened to, one of the members of the Bull Run Red Civil War Roundtable also happened to be the Marine Corps historian. And we got together at a local Manassas pub after a meeting one night, and he knew my special interest was the Shenandoah Valley. So he invited me to give a co-tour with him with the Quantico Marines, and we did that a few times in the 90s as well. So I really benefited from from having the right connections. Very lucky at times with people who I knew,
So
including.
I have a special interest in Atlanta. When will be the next time you give any Atlanta-based tours?
Let's see. I just did a 5-year series of them that just ended pre-COVID, I think 2019. I think maybe not for another 2 years. I'm doing more Revolutionary War tours lately, and I'm back to the Shenandoah Valley beginning in the fall as well. So it's been for about a year. Nobody's been giving tours, obviously. So it's just started back up again. So a lot of tours that I had planned for last year had been postponed instead of canceled. So everything's kind of pushed back into a fall schedule. So I'll have a huge run of them beginning in September and October.
So if you were going to have last words for this program, do you have any final thoughts, any last words you'd like to share with the audience?
I had so many words before. Well, last words is hopefully everybody appreciates. I have a feeling that most people never heard of Logan or didn't know anything about him. And my job today was to try to introduce you to who he was and what he did. And what Logan is, I consider Logan the most noteworthy 19th century American who has almost completely escaped the notice of the 20th and the 21st century. So my job was to kind of bring him back to you so you understand why he was so noteworthy in the 19th century. I would say because he kind of dropped off the face of the earth after the state song was adopted, and we haven't heard about him since then. So that was my job tonight, or this afternoon. Hopefully that was accomplished.
Thank you very much. So Howard Marks, if you're still there, do you have any final words before we say farewell to the gathering? And I hear silence. So thank you very much, Gary. You were wonderful.
Thank you very much.